Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well and staying safe. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this talk organised by McCann. My name is Salma Kami. I'm a British Palestinian barrister with experience in Britain and Palestine, working on issues related to Palestinian human rights. And I am the guest host for today's talk with McCann. McCann is a Palestinian-led educational organisation that works to strengthen voices for Palestinian rights through workshops, training, online resources, and more. And we're very excited to be joined by Kelsey Mohammed and Joshua Virasamy. Thank you to both of you so much for joining us this evening. Kelsey is a feminist campaigner and full-time mischief maker based in London, organising in campaigns against state violence and working to explore and build alternative support, specifically addressing violence experienced by women and gender non-conforming people of colour and other marginalised groups. As a freelance facilitator with grassroots collectives Cradle and Resist and Renew, she facilitates workshops on conflict, bystander intervention, and tools for campaigning and movement building. Joshua is an activist, artist, and writer. He is a member of the London Renters Union, Wretched of the Earth, and Black Lives Matter UK. His recently published book, How to Change It, Make a Difference, is out with Murky Books now. Behind the scenes, we also have McCann staff here with us, Hussein and Sarona, and they will be the ones writing to you in the chat bar and making sure that everything runs smoothly. So, before we start our conversation with our speakers, I'd like to give you a brief background on today's topic. Following the recent Israeli onslaught on Gaza, settler violence in Jerusalem, and the outbreak across historic Palestine of what many are calling the Unity Intifada, there has been a dramatic surge in interest and support for the Palestinian cause, with an explosion of social media activity, especially among young people, and hundreds and thousands of people taking to the streets in Britain and around the world. But attacks on Palestinian activism and advocacy have only continued and in some cases intensified. The shrinking space, as Palestine activists refer to it, encompasses the multiple ways in which Palestinians and their supporters have been silenced and criminalised, from the demonisation and defamation of people and organisations working on Palestine, to the surveillance of particular groups such as young Arabs and Muslims, and the systematic attacks on the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement. In the last few months in Britain, we have witnessed the censoring and exclusion of children in schools as they show support for Palestine. And in recent demonstrations in London, there have been accounts of violent arrests and questioning of protesters. The backdrop of this appears to be linked to two things in particular: the adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism, and the implementation of the British government's anti-terrorism prevent agenda. Alongside decades of smear campaigns and silencing of Palestinian advocates, these two developments have proved particularly damaging. According to the IHRA definition, describing Israel as a racist endeavour is an example of anti-Semitism. Similarly, the prevent agenda cites vocal support for Palestine and criticism of British foreign policy in the Middle East as markers of potential radicalisation or extremism. The ramifications of these initiatives have been far-reaching, successfully shutting down space for Palestine activism and creating a huge chilling effect and a climate of self-censorship. We know, however, this climate of suppression is not unique to Palestine, but is being felt across multiple social justice movements. After more than a decade of conservative rule in Britain and the election in 2019 of arguably the most right-wing Tory government to date, British state repression has dramatically increased. This is particularly evident in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests last summer, sustained environmental justice activism over the last few years, and the resurgence of feminist organising in early 2021 after the murder of Sarah Everard. So, in this talk, we hope to explore these barriers to effective mobilisation, as well as the openings and the possibilities for a collective struggle for freedom. And with this background in mind, I'd like to start the discussion with Kelsey and Joshua. So, Kelsey and Joshua, let's start by talking about our respective work. It would be great if you could tell our audience a little bit about yourselves and your work, the movements you're involved with within the broader context of social justice activism in the UK. Could I perhaps ask Kelsey to start on this one, and then we'll hear from Joshua, and then I'll chip in with a bit of background about myself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me here today, and it's nice to see you both. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'll kind of mention a few bits that I'm involved in. So most of my work and organising is focused around prison abolition, and I kind of came to that in part because of this like wider social context of austerity, where we've seen like our public services being decimated over the last over a decade now, and seeing particularly the impact that was having for survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence in our communities, and the ways that all of the support services that had started off as grassroots support and had become like formalized within the welfare state and state structures that had left them vulnerable to then being gutted by the state. And what we've seen at the same time as like the loss of our community centers, our women's shelters, our youth services, all of these things, as well as like the selling off and privatization of council housing, and sort of like that general sort of like decimation happening to our community support. What we've seen has been a focus on policing, on still finding money always to try to build more prisons, which has been the kind of plan since 2016. And so I kind of have been involved in campaigns kind of focusing on what we call prison expansion. So the way that they're trying to build what is now a number of 18,000 new prison places across the UK, in various things that they're calling mega prisons. These are all like being sort of the areas that they are targeting are areas that are often like the areas that have been hardest hit by austerity. So we see like a very clear line between austerity and policing and imprisonment, and sort of this government's kind of response to all social issues that it creates, for that being further policing and further capacity for putting people in cages, at the same time as seeing like a rise in the detention movement and stricter border controls, all of these things as well. So that's kind of the context that we're in, and I'm part of those, as I said, like supporting a network of local campaigns trying to resist the proposed prisons at these various sites. And I've also, and then as a facilitator and someone who is committed to transformative justice, have been working within my community to support survivors to either like find safety or build accountability in our communities, or to help build those mechanisms of supporting people who are impacted by policing, so like stop and search and things like that as well. So yeah, that's like a little bit about the stuff that I'm doing and the kind of context that's within.
I've just muted myself by accident. Sounds like you've been busy and that you've had a lot to work on. And I'd really like to come back to some of the themes that you raised. But first, I'd like to hear as well from Joshua what kind of, little bit more about yourself and sort of campaigns you're involved in.
Cool. Thanks for inviting me here to participate in this conversation. I'm a big fan of McCann. And I think, Kelsey, this is the first event we've done together, but we're like always around each other, so it's nice to be in conversation. And I think it's an extremely important topic for so many different reasons. It's historically always been a really important topic, but especially now in this moment with this particular government and in this particular climate with the series of bills that are being pushed through, I'm always on the tip of swearing, but I don't know if I'm allowed to swear. I'm just gonna say that shit's been bad, but it's gonna get markedly worse. So yeah, I'm very glad to be here. Just briefly about me, I guess I got involved in social movements and activism about 10 years ago. About 10 years ago, which is, almost like, I'm getting older. And I got involved kind of around the time of the Indignados and the kind of Occupy movement and the Arab Spring and this kind of like rising call for more democracy and for more participation in politics, and also kind of like off the back of these like the economic crisis. And it was a very special time to get involved with movements then. Since then, I've been involved in lots of different movements, like Occupy. I was very involved with that. I've been involved in like environmental movements, done stuff around airports, and where I grew up in Hounslow, we were under the flight path, so it's something that's very close to me. And where my family's from in Mauritius, it's one of the places that are kind of will be most affected by the impacts of climate change. So it's always felt very close to me, and I've been involved in various environmental movements. I've also been involved with Black Lives Matter UK, again, like from my own personal experiences growing up and going back home and coming into more anti-imperialist politics, understanding that race and racism kind of shape the global economy. So I've been involved in BLM, and we've done loads of stuff over the years, and maybe we'll probably get into it a bit. But those experiences over the 10 years have just kind of taken me across so many different campaigns, and I've been involved in so many different things. I'm also a facilitator and a trainer. I'm also part of Resist and Renew with Kelsey. And I've been a trainer and facilitator with an organisation called Campaign Bootcamp that does lots of like training for campaigners and organisers across Britain, but also across Europe. I've been involved in kind of the police custody campaigns through BLM UK, which will probably come up in the conversations that we have. And yeah, I guess like on that, through that journey over the last 10 years, kind of, I didn't come to activism to necessarily, or get involved in social movements with a mindset to kind of oppose the surveillance state and the repressive apparatus of the state. But through getting involved in Kelsey, I'm sure you had the same thing, like through getting involved, you begin to understand how serious that issue is, and how broad the nexus is, and how much you have to be on top of what's happening in terms of how you're being surveyed and how your movements are being undermined. And Occupy was very much a crash course for me in that. It was the first time where I understood that we were being designated as a terrorist organization. And then BLM and environmental movements were kind of like really chickens coming home to roost with understanding how serious this is. But then also, like, not going off on too much of a tangent, but then being able to think back on moments back in school years and university years, like friends that were being approached by Prevent and piecing things together, and friends that were being surveyed by the police in relation to gang stuff. So yeah, various different movements. Hopefully that covered some of it and gave some context, but
Yeah, no, it does, absolutely. And I think, we're going to return a lot to these themes of how sort of state repression kind of underlines a lot of these movements, unfortunately, and means that there are connections between them too. And I think the purpose of this event is really to try to start to explore the links between things. I'll just give a quick overview of what I do. I'm far less interesting than either of you, I have to say, and involved in, I suppose, a slightly less broad range of activism. My background is basically as a person of Palestinian heritage, raised in the UK, but also trained as a lawyer, kind of wanted to use my legal skills in support of the Palestinian cause. I worked for a few years in Palestine in a human rights NGO, doing litigation, trying to bring cases that would hold Israeli authorities and those that were complicit with the Israeli authorities accountable. So accountability has been a big part of my work. And since being back in the UK, I've basically done my best to sort of use my skills to support, in some cases, to continue working with Palestinian NGOs on the ground to do their kind of legal and human rights work on the one hand, and on the other hand, to support campaign groups and activists here working on the Palestinian cause, who have been increasingly facing different forms of repression and different measures aimed at really silencing them and stopping them from being able to be active. And I've lent support often behind the scenes in taking measures to try to counteract that sort of repression. And I'm sure we'll come to talk about that more. I'd like to move on to our next question now. This question is really about, so both of you have kind of somewhat set the scene of what you think the climate kind of your campaign work has been over the last few years by telling us what you both do and what the amazing stuff you're both involved with. But it would be great to hear a little bit more about what you think is the specific kind of political and social climate in this country at the moment, or in recent years, that you've within which your work has taken place. And what would you say are the specific sort of campaigns that have taken hold recently? Are there any particular trends or turning points or events in campaigning work that you think have really been watershed moments, for example, that have been helpful in perhaps challenging the status quo? Like how would you broadly describe the sort of climate for activism and the important campaigns that you've been involved with recently? And could I ask Josh to address this question first, and then Kelsey?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the way that I first approached this question was thinking about what the state response has been to, I guess, particular forms of activism that have been gaining steam and have been very successful in recent years. But I think you're right, it'd be good to kind of situate what some of those things are. Sometimes I forget how long BLM has been around. BLM has been around since 2013. So it's been 8 years of a movement that's been building itself. And, for the first couple of years, that was really situated in the US. But from 2015, 2016, that movement was really picking up steam around the world. And I think here in Britain, it's been a movement that's just constantly growing. And the discourse around it is growing, and the kind of educational resources and the language around it and the understanding around it has just been non-stop growth. And I think so there's kind of been and that means that whenever there is a situation, and this is in an atmosphere of a really decentralized slogan and a decentralized movement. So whenever there is a situation in which there is a massive injustice, people are able to pick up this movement and the slogan and these ideas and these narratives and just run with it. And that's part of why it was so successful last year. And so I think we have this backdrop of this really healthy, growing anti-racist movement that has taken the grip of lots of people's imagination. And that is both like on the streets with street movements, but also in workplaces, in cultural institutions, in the media. Like there is this growing movement, and then at the cutting edge of it is this abolitionist edge of the movement, which is making really strategic, radical demands of the criminal justice system. Like, for example, the idea around defunding the police and stopping the use of tasers and other very important demands. So I think there's this, and I think very importantly to that is this kind of like growing cultural awareness and like cultural interventions. And I think that we might come back to that as part of what some people call a culture war, or maybe we can think about it as a kind of continued war in the realm of culture, because a culture war is, there's two parties, and there's not really two parties in this culture war. But so I think there's that, and then there's obviously what I think a lot of people would have noticed, which is like a massive, in a very similar way, always growing, very healthy environmental movement. We have had the student strikers, we've had Extinction Rebellion, and I think similarly there's been that's like arrested people's attention across society, like that has built movements, like lawyers that are in support of this, and councils have taken up some of the demands around this. And so I think, and that again, I think precipitates stuff like the police crime sentencing and courts bill, which takes aim quite explicitly at some of the tactics that both of these movements have used. So I think you have both of these movements really, really, really healthy, really thriving, really connecting the dots across issues, capturing the attention of people across society. And then I think another thing, just quickly before we move on, is like there's also been a lot awareness raising and campaigning around spy cops and around the surveillance state, and around there's been lots of release, in the last few years we've had lots of big releases around how many campaigns the police were spying on. We've had really liberal institutions taking up the call, like Lush doing this big anti-spy cops campaign, and these things I think also precipitate some of the state's response to in terms of repression to these movements. So I think these are a few things that have been kind of floating in the realm.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's a good way of sort of capturing the main dynamics that are at play. And before I turn to Kelsey, I just want to do a quick follow-up. I mean, I was curious, are there any particular was there a particular turning point, do you think, let's say for the BLM movement in this country, that really kind of brought it into the mainstream in the way that it currently is? Because I'm trying to think back over the last couple of years, what was it that really sparked that? Was it a particular instance of police brutality, you think, that, or you know what I mean?
I think I don't want to hypothesize too much around it, but I think 2013, 2010, 2011 is when a lot of people are like, oh wow, the power of social media, the Arab Spring, and people are kind of putting two and two together with the power of these kind of democratic platforms on the internet. And I think 2013 is, this is really hot on the heels of that period, and that's maybe one of the first instances where you have racial justice movements really taking the full power of the internet. And it begins with this slogan. I think the slogan, the fact that the organizers of these movements aren't disconnected to the trajectories of those kind of the Occupy movements, the Square movements, the Indignados, the Arab Spring. They very much take a lot of the flavor and character of these movements. And so when that movement comes up, it's quite decentralized. People are very able to move quite freely with the slogans and with the tactics. And there's not this kind of traditional approach on the left of quite heavy-handed, you can't do that unless you use this thing or you sign up to these values. So I think it has a lot of freedom to live and breathe. And then I think people took up the baton here. It wasn't I'm part of BLM UK and there's lots of other groups. We did work. We had experiences organizing. We had networks. We had skills. So we did things to put this into the discourse. We pushed it out. We did direct action to make sure that people can, and through those direct actions, we brought through the campaigns that have been here for a while, like the UFFC, and we gave them platform. People could hear, could hear the numbers of how many people have died in police custody and could understand the cases. And so, yeah, we built on the work that was already existing. I think it's very important to kind of think of it as a lineage, an unbroken line of struggle. And that
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
That's super interesting. I mean, these are not, it's very good to have these sorts of digressions because, that's the meat of the issues come out. Kelsey, how would you sort of characterize the climate of activism over the last few years and the sort of successes, turning points?
I think Josh has obviously covered a lot of the really important kind of things that have been going on. I'm glad that you mentioned the Spy Cops inquiry, because I think for me that's been something that's really highlighted because those cases go back to the 60s and throughout the 80s, and the current kind of Spy Cops inquiry is around the infiltrations that happened around sort of the 80s and 90s, which and I'm not going to go too much into it here, but I really recommend people watching to look up the Police Spies Out of Lives campaign that's led by the women who were tricked into relationships with undercover police officers over long periods of time, into long-term relationships, and targeted very specifically. Thank you for sharing that in the chat. And kind of for me, that's just been a real indicator of how deeply we can understand the lengths that the state will go to just know about dissent. So lots of these groups, they didn't this didn't result in prosecutions. These weren't groups that were like domestic terrorists or anything. These were women's rights groups. There was like a knitting club that was infiltrated. There was also, of course, the Stephen Lawrence campaign and people who were trying to hold the police accountable themselves, who had lost people to racist violence. Like these are the people who they will infiltrate. And I think that is like a really just important kind of legacy that we are living under of that state repression. And for us, a lot of our...
Kelsey, sorry to interrupt. Just for the people who might not be aware, could you just expand very briefly on what the Spy Cops inquiry is?
Right. So yeah, the Spy Cops inquiry is what I'm saying is the government inquiry that's happening at the moment, but will probably be happening for the next couple of years. It's just been going through like another one of the what they call tranches, which is just a word that I've never said out loud before. That's basically some of the women who've come forward who found out that they had been tricked into these relationships with undercover police, trying to find some accountability for that. They're kind of aware that like probably through that system that isn't actually where they're going to find justice. So I think the point really is the public outrage, and to really for people to know and for us to really like find justice through like changing how policing operates in this country and beyond. So I think that's just a really important one for me. Some other things that I kind of want to mention that I think have been really important, I guess, have been obviously after the Windrush scandal, there's been, like just a lot of resistance and a lot of sort of connecting with young people and intergenerationally, sort of in resistance to immigration raids, to deportations, and through that, like I guess what we've seen is just that there are so many connections, and there are literal connections through the money, right? Like that it's often the same private companies that are enforcing border control or running detention centers as are providing or creating like building equipment for the military in other countries or in settler colonies. And it's often these same companies, G4S, Serco, even these construction companies like Kia that are involved in gentrification and prison building. All of these kinds of connections have meant that there's been actually like a real room for people to see those connections and to see how these same corporations are profiting off of these social issues that the state is creating. And so and that the state actors, like that these individuals within the state often are themselves invested in those same corporations or have personal ties to them, etc. And so I guess that's just another kind of important thing that I wanted to mention in terms of the scene of like activism that's happening, the kind of way that people are making these connections, and that's particularly through like student movements and things like, Sodexo and Serco and all these companies that often like work through these other institutions as well, or have contracts with them, as well as being able to target like airlines and all of these things that have been really effective. And I guess what I wanted to also mention was, I guess I specifically put myself in describing myself as a feminist prison abolitionist, because through the last several decades, I suppose, there's been like a building feminist movement in the UK that in more recent times has somewhat split, right? Has somewhat become very hostile kind of towards each other in many ways. And that is one of those is a feminist movement that has that is what we call the carceral feminist movement, or is a liberal feminist movement that is one that is seeing great gains in terms of getting misogyny legislation through, and is we have people like Theresa May who put forward the domestic violence and abuse bill, and these things that show deep concern apparently for violence against only cis women, but unfortunately, these same movements, they are often or like those same legislations often have really awful implications for women of color, for trans women, for migrants, for people who are impacted by the criminal justice system. So, for example, the Domestic Violence and Abuse Bill was just very much focused on longer sentences for perpetrators, longer, all of these things that build up the prison system, more laws, more harsher policing for this kind of violence, but not any commitment to actually finding that support for survivors, for building housing, building these spaces that we mean, or like these support systems that mean that violence will happen less and that people will be supported for their trauma and for their experiences of violence. So I guess I wanted to put that forward as there's been these kinds of gains within legislation on that end, and yet through the last sort of 5 to 7 years or more, we've had groups like Sisters Uncut who have increasingly, while first focusing on cuts to domestic violence services, have increasingly turned their attention to the way that the criminal justice system and these increases in policing and sort of state repression specifically impact women. And we can see that in no more other situations than specifically that Spike Ops inquiry and those cases that we spoke about, the way that sexual violence is deeply to repression in and of itself, but also the way that the majority of people who within women's prisons are themselves survivors domestic and sexual violence. And so, basically we've had groups like Sisters Uncut who have been drawing more attention to that side of it and fighting for liberation that is not just intersectional, but is actually anti-racist and is anti-imperialist and abolitionist itself. Those are the things.
I mean, just a quick technical thing. So I'm not sure, Kelsey, your picture and your sound seems to be slightly cracking up a little bit. I'm not sure if those behind the scenes can help with that at all. We can still basically hear you, but perhaps perhaps it's something they may work on, or perhaps it's just a question of tweaking your system in some way. Now, just to say, I mean, this is it's really so fascinating what you're talking about, and it is the number of questions I have from what you've both been saying, sort of mushrooming in my mind. And it's a pity we don't have so much longer to talk, because something that Kelsey raised that I thought was really interesting was this question about to what extent have these campaigns and these movements that have actually, as you've both described, really started to develop a sophisticated kind of worldview about what people's suffering is caused by, what is the role of state repression, how these things need to be combated, what kinds of demands need to be made. I'm wondering the extent to which those sorts of movements, which have developed this sort of sophisticated, I suppose I wouldn't say ideology, but explanations of the world, are being in some ways undermined by branches within those movements that have a more liberal outlook. Whether we would say that those movements are in fact being on, is our liberal takes on these kinds of movements just insufficient to deal with a problem? So they're fine to be there, but we wish they would go further. Or I'm wondering whether in some cases they actually could potentially be harmful. And that's a question we can return to in a moment after we talk about direct sort of state repression of these movements, which is what we're going to come to. Now, I've been asked to also contribute a little bit in answering this question about the Palestine movement. And so and I'll keep it brief. It's just to say, I think certainly one thing I think that's characterized Palestine activism over the decades is that it hasn't been particularly good at making links with other kinds of social movements. That's not to say that there aren't activists within Palestine campaigning that aren't also heavily involved in lots of other things. But I think the mainstay of Palestine activism has been quite kind of single issue, and it's been dealing with the Palestinian cause as though it's just on its own merits. And I think that's changing. So I think that's one trend we're seeing. I think those sorts of realizations that you've both mentioned, especially Kelsey, you talked about people starting to connect the dots and understand, for example, that there's a lot of companies making profit off the back of their repression. There are links between the establishment and the private sector. I think the Palestine movement is starting to become more and more aware of that too. For example, understanding that many of the companies involved in austerity in this country, to which the government has outsourced contracts, are also complicit with Israeli repression in the Palestinian territories. I think another thing is that, of course, we've had the BDS movement, that's the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, which has really gained traction and ground since it was conceived of in 2005. And I think the very nature of that movement is also one which is inviting internationalism. It's inviting solidarity from people all over the world, from, for example, indigenous people in other countries. It's because it's conceiving of Israel as an apartheid regime. It's also inviting basically others involved in anti-racist struggles to see the connections between them and the struggle that the Palestinians are waging. So I think those are really important advances that have been made in the direction of essentially building a movement and a struggle that isn't just a single issue campaign. I'd say just very briefly as well, the general climate in this country is one that I think has become quite polarized around Palestine. And I wonder if this is what we're really seeing with all of these social movements, which is that there has been relative success of these movements, including the Palestine movement, the BDS movement over the years. And that has resulted in a sort of panic by the establishment, and as a result, very brutal and sort of repressive countermeasures that are being taken that are now, these movements are now having to respond to. So we're now in a situation we may not have been in 10 years ago, which is that these movements, including that for Palestinian rights, are more mainstream and actually more popular, and actually are garnering support from sort of all these different sectors of society. And that could be heralded as a great success. But as a result, the backlash by, in the case of Palestine, both the UK government, but also the Israeli state, working through various non-governmental organizations, has been really, really severe. And I think in particular, the fact that the rise of Corbyn as the Labour leader, and that's the relative success he had, was a moment in which there was a real fierce backlash against Corbyn and against Palestine, and it achieved twin aims of suppressing the left of the Labour Party in particular, and also in suppressing pro-Palestinian support for pro-Palestinian campaigns. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about how that has actually happened when we come to our next question, which is about the repression that these movements have faced. But yeah, in summary, I think we're in a position where we've really, I hate this word, mainstreamed support for Palestine, but as a result, we are in a situation where countermeasures against Palestine activism are really becoming increasingly severe. So let's move on then to our next question, which is really about this question of repression. I'd be interested to hear about what you think are some of the specific ways in which the government in this country has been cracking down on the social justice movements that you've been involved in. And what has been the impact as well of these crackdowns. I've been asked to address this question first, and then to have Josh and then Kelsey address that question. So I will attempt to sort of summarize what we've been seeing in terms of repression of Palestine activism. There's been a lot, so it's going to be quite hard to summarize, but I'll give it my best shot. So I think, broadly speaking, one thing that I think is quite important in terms of understanding the repression against Palestine activism is to understand that it is a worldwide phenomenon, and that it is ultimately originates from the Israeli state itself. So, the Israeli state has been concerned about things like the BDS movement and suppressing and silencing criticism of Israel for many, many years, at least particular since kind of 2001, which is where you had the so-called Second Intifada that broke out in Palestine against Israel's occupation. But in particular, in 2015, the Israeli government established a special ministry. So it's called the Ministry of Strategic Affairs and Public Diplomacy. And the explicit role of that ministry is to what it what it says is to act against the so-called delegitimization and boycott campaigns against the state of Israel. And it also has an explicit mandate to do that worldwide and to do that in conjunction with pro-Israeli organizations in different countries. And so I'm saying that because people often talk about a sort of pernicious Israel lobby or a conspiracy, you know, headed by the Israeli state. And what I'm trying to say is it's not really, I'm not attempting to say there's a conspiracy or to draw on any tropes here. I'm saying there's actually an explicit plan. It's an Israeli state-sponsored plan, and we're seeing the effects of it on a daily basis now. And all of that information is in the public domain, and Israel isn't hiding it. What this has meant in practice is, I think there is a plethora of sort of pro-Israeli organizations, sort of campaign groups, lobby groups, that are working in some way in conjunction with the Israeli state, sometimes directly or indirectly with the support of the Israeli state and with the support of the British government in this country, to suppress Palestine activism. And we've seen sort of a kind of, you know, I would say an avalanche really of things like harassment and smear campaigns against Palestinian NGOs, attempts to target NGOs funding and funding for Palestine charities by accusing organizations of being funding terrorism, for example. We've seen you know, all kinds of smear campaigns against individual campaigners and campaign groups, especially using the allegation that those campaigners are anti-Semitic, and that's something I'll return to. And so that's what we're seeing in general, and that's happening not necessarily directly but as attacks from the British state, but there's a climate, like I said, of attacks from pro-Israeli organizations in this country, which I think are really being supported in various ways by the Israeli state. Now, the British government is playing its role in certainly assisting the Israeli state really in suppressing Palestine activism. And I think there's two main reasons that the British state is invested in doing that. I think firstly, it's because Britain and Israel are allies. There's all kinds of connections, in particular in relation to the arms trade between Israel and in the UK, which means that Britain perceives it to be in its own interests to assist its ally in this respect. But also Britain, I think, considers it to be in its own interest to suppress Palestine activism, because in so doing, it's able to bring in a host of repressive measures which suppress activism across the board, right? All of these social movements that the state fears or is concerned in some way challenge the established order or the status quo can be suppressed through the vehicle of suppressing Palestine activism. And I'll give you a couple of examples about how we see that happening in practice. So I'd say the three main arms of the British state's repression of Palestine activism. Firstly, you have legislative measures that the government has attempted to bring in to stop public bodies from supporting BDS, in particular from divesting, making divestment decisions based on the Palestine BDS movement. So they try to bring in regulations to stop local councils divesting from, say, Israeli companies or companies that are complicit in Israel's occupation. And they didn't succeed because the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is a campaigning group, actually challenged that legislation in the Supreme Court, got all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they recently succeeded in overturning it. But I think what was interesting about that legislation is it didn't just try to prevent local councils from divesting from Israeli occupation. It was phrased in such a way, that legislation, that would have stopped local councils from making divestment decisions on the grounds of, for example, the British arms industry and boycotts against any foreign nation. So, for example, if a local council wanted to divest from a UK arms manufacturer because of its involvement in repression overseas somewhere other than Palestine, that would have been prohibited by this legislation. And as a result, in the court case to challenge that legislation, you got a coalition of organizations working, not just Palestine campaign organizations, but also the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, War on Wants, and others. Have we lost Kelsey? Oh, you're good. You're back. Good. I thought we lost you for a second. So that's the first arm of the attacks by the British state, which is legislation aimed in some way or other at stifling and potentially even criminalising the BDS movement. And there are other examples of legislation that the Conservative Party said they wish to propose in the future, which I can come back to if people are interested. Okay, so the second major thing, the second major line of attack, I think, has been the kind of manipulative use of this so-called IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So this is just a definition of anti-Semitism that was floating around. It didn't really have any particular status, but the UK government decided to endorse it in 2016 and has since then been pressuring public bodies and universities to adopt it into their anti-racism disciplinary procedures. So what that would mean is that this definition could be used to discipline or silence, say, students in a university or employees of a public body for making expressions which are engaging in activities that are considered to be anti-Semitic. Now, that ordinarily might be absolutely fine. We're all for tackling anti-Semitism, but this IHRA definition that these bodies have been pressured to adopt defines essentially calling Israel a racist endeavor, the state of Israel a racist endeavor, as anti-Semitic. And it has been widely interpreted and applied to mean that essentially saying that Israel is an apartheid state, supporting the BDS movement, that all of those things are now anti-Semitic and therefore dubious. This has had a huge, huge chilling effect. And we know that in practice, activists, students, employees of public bodies are saying they are either afraid now to engage in Palestine activism, or they are actually being threatened with disciplinary measures on occasion when they, for example, supported things like Israel Apartheid Week, which happens annually on campuses. It's part of a series of events raising awareness about Israeli apartheid. Now, more often than not, events are being closed down or people are being disciplined, not directly citing the IHRA, but we believe that that's the motivating factor, but by imposing other sorts of barriers. And the main set of barriers, and this takes me to the third and final kind of set of measures that the government has imposed to prevent Palestine activism, and that is the PREVENT framework, which I hope you guys will be familiar with. Basically, the PREVENT strategy is purportedly part of the government's response to terrorism, attempt to prevent radicalization and terrorism on UK soil. It, amongst other things, it places a duty on public bodies to supposedly identify early warning signs of radicalization or terrorist sympathies in people, and then report those people to the state, and various interventions are then taken. Now, the problem with PREVENT is it's been used to survey, essentially, and profile students engaged in Palestine activism, or who come from certain racial, ethnic, religious backgrounds where they think may be sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, and supporting Palestine or being against Israeli oppression is actually being defined under the PREVENT framework as a potential indicator of radicalization or extremism, which is justifying the profiling and surveying of students and others who are involved in Palestine work. There are a couple of really egregious examples of PREVENT being used to close down pro-Palestine meetings in universities, and there's lots of anecdotal evidence of students saying, including even school children, saying they're actually scared now to voice support for Palestine because it means they come under the PREVENT rubric. So there's a hell of a lot, going on there. But what I would say is the unifying issue is that you've got an Israeli state strategy, explicit strategy of suppressing Palestine activism worldwide, and especially the BDS movement. And then you have the UK government, I think, co-opted in helping implement that strategy for the twin aims of supporting their ally, but also for enforcing a particular order that they wish to see enforced domestically, and which then acts as a very useful vehicle in the suppression of other social movements. That's how I would summarize it. Could I turn now to first to Josh and then to Kelsey, as pleased to speak a little bit as well about kind of what you've seen to be state repression of the movements that you're involved in.
Thank you very much, Salma. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible so we have a good amount of time for questions from the audience. I guess the first thing to say is, and I guess bouncing a bit off the question that you said before about like what's the danger of the more kind of liberal tendencies within our movements, is just to kind of say quite explicitly that, you know, for some people, these are kind of accidental or unfortunate excesses and abuses of power within the system, for which we need to kind of just legislate away some of the pains of these things that are being pushed through, especially in a set of bills that are being pushed through right now. And that's not to say that I don't think it's important that we have an attack on these bills at the level of legislature, but what I would argue, and I think what us on the panel would argue, is that actually this kind of operation is fundamental to the maintenance of this economic system. It's fundamental to the maintenance of capitalist relations, to put it out of terms. And it's a strategic level of organization that happens at the highest levels of the state, with the highest levels of superiority within the repressive apparatus of the state. So this is fundamental to the organization of the capitalist state. And that's apparent because, and I think it's good to kind of talk about exactly what's happening right now, but just to kind of double back, like the special branch of the police was formed to curtail movements that were building social power against exploitation and oppression. And a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of the kind of, I was going to say magic, what's that magic? A lot of the kind of like strategies and tools that the state uses against these various leftist movements we've spoken about here were developed in the colonies. The colonies were the laboratory. The 20th century, especially, and the period of decolonization and the Cold War and the kind of neo-colonial period was where a lot of this stuff was formulated and then brought back to here. And there's some really good, there's a writer called Connor Woodman who writes really, really well about this. But also there's an author called Aziz Chowdhury who has a book called Activism and the Surveillance State, Learning from Repression. And I just want to shout him out because he has done such important work for kind of raising awareness around what he calls lessons learned and lessons lost. The fact that a lot of, during that period of the kind of late 20th century, and even through the anti-globalization movements, there was lots of stuff learned about how the state represses our movements. You know, you said like about how the Palestinian struggle in this moment can be or could be quite tunnel visioned. And it made me think immediately of like Kanafani and like lots of Palestinian revolutionaries in the past that were like very much, their politics was one of like third worldist, anti-imperialist solidarity across the world. And that movement was surveyed, sabotaged, and of course he was assassinated. And I think there's lots to learn from that period until now. And I want to shout Aziz Chowdhury as well, because unfortunately he passed away last month. So in some ways this is for you, dog. And I guess on that kind of like, to kind of come back to this moment, I think it's like, where do you even begin? I think what a very important bill to talk about, bill that's being, I think has actually passed, is a CHIS bill, which is the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill, which is about how spies can operate in this country. And I think it's created it's created an atmosphere. It's a statement it's a statement from the state saying that nobody can police the police. You know, to take a quote directly from the bill on the government website, it says, it authorizes conduct by officials and agents of the security and intelligence services, law enforcement, and other public authorities which would otherwise constitute criminality. And a lot of the people, important organizations like Pat Finnegan Society, were like, who understand what happens when you have no oversight on the behaviors of spies in movements, is that they will kill. You know, this Pat Finnegan Society is looking at the experience and the troubles. They're saying that if you don't have any oversight, they will torture, kill, and rape people within the movement. And the fact is, the bill has been passed, and that is exactly what this bill is doing. It's state sanctioned, right to kill within and do whatever they need to do within the movement to survey, sabotage, and destroy social movements. And an important part of that, and I think is an important tendency, especially within this kind of, as you said, Salma, especially right-wing government, is that they're kind of expanding the scope of the departments and agencies and authorities within the government that can utilize these kind of things. So as well as being used by the Home Office and the traditional institutions that we might associate with, they've also expanded it to, I think, 10 other departments, which includes things like the Environmental Agency, the Food Standards Agency. So and that's also a mirror image of what we see with Prevent kind of in its in this kind of huge sprawling web of counter extremist technologies, is like also expanded towards health and education workers. And it's been an important part of what lots of campaigns around Prevent have been speaking about. I think, and maybe the way I kind of think about it is we have that kind of legislative level. There's also, as you mentioned, Salma, like the kind of on the streets level of what the enforcement of a lot of this stuff looks like. And there's a really great, you mentioned the kind of policing of BLM protests. There's a really great report called Britain is Not Innocent that was released by Netpol that looks at the fact that the Black-led protests last year were disproportionately faced extreme violence, and they were excessively policed, and kind of demonstrate how the police are responding to this kind of political movement. There's also, just quickly, there's also kind of like the cultural terrain. I mean, there's the PCSC bill. We'll probably come to that. I'll leave that for now. I'm sure we'll come to it. But there's also the kind of cultural terrain on which the government is making war with movements, continuing to make war with movements. One of the things that came out last year and people are campaigning around is the teachers' guidance. Guidance to teachers, which kind of basically says that they're not allowed to teach anti-capitalist discourse or any discourse which kind of challenges the status quo and the status quo of the economic and political system we live under. It mirrors a lot of the kind of tendencies of Prevent. Also says like they can't talk about victimhood narratives, and everybody so clearly as they understood that as like an attack on the BLM movement. So there's that atmosphere within the educational establishments, and then there's what people call the culture wars, which, as people can see, with the stuff about the kind of white privilege disadvantaging white working class kids, these cherry pick lines from reports that they kind of, the Tony Sowell report that they've commissioned, and they've commissioned it in order to kind of stoke up the culture war. It creates it continues a moral panic, and enhances these folk devils, and creates more of a kind of atmosphere of suspicion and resentment towards political movements and violence towards political movements. And it's less a culture war for me, and more of a like them continuing their program of repression and of it's dismantling leftist movements through the terrain of culture. And also, as you said, like the people, a lot of interests overlap here. The people who run the mainstream media are on multiple levels of interests within kind of maintaining the status quo of racial capitalism, but also this sells shit, like this sells papers, more eyeballs on this stuff when it's like this kind of really provocative idea of Black Lives Matter undermining what Britishness represents. So I think those are a few of the ways it is expanded, and I think it's also important to kind of see it as a continuing tradition of repressing social movements.
I always forget how to unmute myself, sorry. That's a super good sort of summary, I think. And I think what's emerging is it's almost a sort of methodology of repression, which we're seeing being mirrored across the repression undertaken against social movements, which is there's a kind of layer which is legislative. There's a layer which attacks sort of free speech, tries to kind of impose on institutions, restrictions on what they can say, what they can teach. And then there's this layer of the so-called cultural war, which is, it seems from what you're saying, is really a way of stoking up a kind of ideas in society and a narrative which will try to, in order to discredit social movements and in order to try to remove support that they might have from certain sectors of the public. And that all these things are kind of working in tandem. And I see that very much reflected towards the Palestine movement. Just really briefly say, we've definitely got the legislative arm in the kind of legislation I was saying that's anti-BDS. We've definitely got the suppression of free speech in terms of the Prevent and the IHRA in public bodies. And the so-called culture war, I think, in the Palestine terrain is essentially this narrative which is trying to say that trying to cast the suspicion that people who support Palestine are in some way potentially anti-Semitic, that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism, and as you said, stoke this moral panic that will mean that people will start to stay away from Palestine activism and reduce support for the Palestinian cause. So I think that's a super interesting sort of framework or rubric for us to understand this within. I shouldn't monopolize the discussion. I'd like to hear from Kelsey, but no, absolutely.
Just one quick thing on that. I think it's really important to stress that there's an overlap here, and like where movements try to show solidarity with the Palestinian movement, there's a really quick coming down of the repressive apparatus. So like, I like, for example, I did an interview with BBC Radio 5 that was supposed to be about something else. It was a trick, and then it turned into this like BLM is an anti-Semitic movement. And that radio interview, it's so available across the internet, like more than anything else I've done. And I'm like, actually, yeah. So there's also a point of like where there's moments of solidarity, are particular points where it's going to come down really hard to try and prevent that. Sorry, I just wanted to throw that in with what you said.
No, that's super interesting, and I'm sorry that happened to you. I mean, yeah, that's what we're all facing at the moment. Kelsey, yeah, please, the floor is yours. I think you might be muted. We can't hear you right now, so are you muted by accident? If you just go over your profile and check, so your camera, so your mic's on, and now you're muted again. Do you want to try again?
Maybe without the headset, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Try unplugging. So yes, we're saying try unplugging your headset. It might be the microphones. No, I tell you what, is there, can you refresh the page? While Kelsey is hopefully sorting herself out and will hopefully come back to us. Josh, what do you think about this? It's a question it's been posed now also by the audience, so we might as well deal with it. Do you think that, oh, hang on. Is Kelsey, are you back?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Okay. No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I mean, thank you both for sharing. I think you've covered most of it. I guess I wanted to just reiterate that it's all part of how the state operates in and of itself, and that policing, imprisonment, all of these things, like, they exist because of resistance. They exist because people aren't just happy to live within a capitalist class structure that means that they will be exploited. Like, that isn't how we are just happy to exist consensually. Like, they enforce it non-consensually by policing and imprisonment. And I guess we wanted to obviously mention the policing, the police crime sentencing and courts bill, that there is, we'll talk a bit more, I assume, about the Kill the Bill campaign, but that is specifically kind of drawing in so many elements of policing, so many things that kind of tie up to how can we get more people into prison, how can we criminalize people who are involved in protest and like increase the chances of those people going into prison. And then once you're in prison, how can we make it even more difficult to get out, because it gives more powers to parole boards, to the officers within prisons, to all of these kinds of things. It adds so many layers to that. And so I think to really think about state repression on this wider level, because the British prison system has always been like hugely repressive, obviously, and for those of us who've been trying to organize, not with even, because we consider everyone to be political prisoners for that reason, and so even to try to organize like basic support for people inside, like way that post is monitored, the way that you are retaliated against for speaking up against the treatment that you experience inside our prisons. All of those things are like, the way that things are monitored, the way that you are brutalized for dissent in any kinds of ways. We know people who wrote BLM on their prison issued T-shirts inside and had them ripped from them and were beaten because of it and things like that, because they tried to show solidarity, and they were Black women who are inside the British prison system here. So I guess I just want to like kind of make that point of like the level of repression that means that if we were to experience a sweep like they did in the 2000s of animal rights activists, for example, or other times when they've done a big sweep and put a load of people like key organizers into prison, they can make it very, very difficult for us to get out, and that can really, really have like a huge impact on the whole movement. And yeah, so and that's just one example, but yeah, I kind of wanted to leave it there.
I mean, just because you raised it, and we actually have a question from one of the members of the audience. Perhaps you could expand a little bit on the bill. So the question in particular from Ron Mendel is, how do you think the crime bill, by which I think he means the I can't actually now remember how the entirety, what is it, the crime sentencing and courts bill, pending in Parliament, will affect your activism? I mean, perhaps you could, if you could, Kelsey, try to address that question and expand a little bit more so people know a little bit more about this bill, and, you know, where has it reached, and what about the campaign to so-called kill the bill? Where's that got to? Like,
yeah, and maybe Josh wants to also come in on this. I don't know how well you also know about the bill, but I guess so
it's the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, is that right? 2021. Okay.
Yeah, I find it quite difficult to keep track of the order of those things each time, but in terms of how it impacts activism, so there are things that we've seen as like direct responses to actions that were taken in the summer. For example, the change in around like statues. If you were to remove a statue, the penalty for that potentially could be up to, I think, like 10 years under this bill, things like that. And similarly, aggravated trespass, which previously would have been maybe like a 6-month maximum, would have can also be something around, I think, 10 years as well under this kind of bill. So we're seeing like huge sort of implications around these crimes that are largely associated with protest, even though actually like things like trespass obviously will impact traveller communities and GRT communities as well, and could have like other kinds of impacts generally around anti-gentrification campaigns and things like that. But I think it's these kinds of things that we're seeing, but also I guess just the way that for us, if we're already focused on the disproportionate targeting of young Black and brown people by police through stop and search and things like that, we're seeing through this bill things that will make it much more easier for those same people to be targeted more, that there's more specific kinds of orders around like a serious violence. So if someone is charged or is sort of arrested for knife crime or something, then maybe an order can go out into the area and anyone can be searched under that order. These kinds of things we're starting to see through this bill, which we know will be targeting like those same people who are already vulnerable to that policing. And so for me, I see that as like an implication that impacts our work already. Equally, I would be very concerned. I don't hear as many of us kind of speaking about this aspect of parole boards, because I think we often think about just the arrest side and the trying not to go to prison for our activism side, but actually to be very concerned about the increased power that parole boards could have, that officers can have inside for recommending you for parole, because chances are that people who work for prisons are not going to be super keen on people who are inside for protesting against policing and such. And so the fact that, it could have like huge kind of implications for just more of our people ending up like criminalized for longer periods of time, or like under surveillance through things like monitoring or curfews and these kinds of things, which we know are the ways that they control our communities. If we can't gather, if we can't meet up with each other, if we can't organize, then it's very hard to change things, right? I don't know if there was other things that you wanted to add, Josh, that are a bit more specific, or anything else.
I think you
about the bill in particular, or
I think you got very specific, and I think that was really, really good. Like coverage of it. I guess I just want to reiterate that the bill doesn't have to pass. It's not inevitable that it will pass, and the only way that we will, the only way in reality we'll make it unenforceable is by practically making it unenforceable. Like like the Covert Human Intelligence Sources bill. There is a lot of political will for this to move through Parliament. But once it goes through, what will make it undefeatable is us being in the streets and directly kind of contravening it. And yeah, and I guess just there was a bit around the serious violence orders. There was a bit that I remember reading, which was like kind of criminalizing, like questioning stop and search. So like you're not allowed to question why you're being stopped and searched, and that just kind of resembled for me that this is in response to what has been successful. You know, like as Kelsey mentioned, Kelsey has done like stop and search training. I've done stop and search training, and that has been a powerful tool in empowering people to be able to challenge police violence. And so that's another one. And I guess there's so many things about protest in there. One of the other really important things is like that you don't have to know, you don't have to be told or even like know what police orders are in place at a protest. You can be charged and sentenced under those orders, and there's a whole variety of orders that they can enforce in a situation at a protest, which can in some instances lead to custodial charges. So and that's been a really important part of activist movements, is like one, like find don't want to go too into it, but how we strategically work around those orders, like how people understand it or don't understand it or can't hear it or all these kinds of things. And they've understood that we understand that. And again, that's a direct response to how we organize. And it's so clear that this bill is really just trying to undermine our ability to assemble, our fundamental right to assemble, which has been the fundamental way we have fought for clawed back every freedom we can from this state, is our ability to get together and protest. So it's so fundamental that however we can, in whatever way we can, we get involved with the movement to kill the bill.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Josh. I have to say, from my little understanding of the bill, the overview I have is absolutely terrifying. It seems to me to be extremely draconian and will really, really seriously criminalize any form of protest, or, as you said, assembly. Small scale gatherings, one person on the street making a bit of a nuisance about themselves can now get 10 years in jail. I mean, it's absolutely insane. It's extraordinary, really, that it's reached the stage it has. You've started really by what you were saying just now about the sort of organising to try to take the bill down, and the need really to respond to the bill. You've come a bit into the last question, so let's go to the last question, and then I'll just remind people we've already got a few questions coming in from the audience. Do remember, those of you who are watching, to submit any questions you have, because we'll come to those next. But yeah, so the final question really that I was hoping you could address is really what are the movements you've been involved with? How are they coping with these attacks, and what are they doing? What are they doing to push back? Do you see any particular possibilities, in the upcoming period for change and for successful kind of fighting back? And could I ask Kelsey, could you address that first, and then Josh, and then I'll make a few remarks as well.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I think, just that there's been, because of the bill, but also because of year and ongoing. Oh, can you still hear me? I feel like I'm like frozen. Okay. the ongoing failures of the government to look after us during the pandemic, and like a general sort of like build up of frustration and anger. The Kill the Bill coalition involves like a really wide range of groups that are all impacted by this bill. So that's feminist groups, that's sex worker groups, that's GRT rights groups. It's obviously anti-policing and prison groups. It's also education groups, groups, migrants rights groups, of coalition, and are planning to through the next stage or not. We'll continue to hit the streets, we'll continue to shout about this, we'll continue to resist it, and whether these legislations go through or not, I believe like people keep, press isn't really something that you can make illegal, like it isn't something you can ask permission to do, and so it is something that we are going to do regardless. It's just that obviously what we need is these infrastructures to support each other in the face of state reform and in the state in this. And so the more people are out there doing it, the more that obviously like on a very like literal level, like it clogs up the courts and it makes it harder for them to deal with many people that they have like resisting to all of these things. But equally, some of the work that we've been doing, which has been about really building mutual aid networks, which started, long before COVID and kind of has had sort of like an upsurgence in some way during the pandemic. And for some of us, we've been building these stronger networks to support people who are policed on the street, who are experiencing violence in their homes, who are vulnerable to immigration raids or are in prison and are themselves coming up to parole hearings, and all these things that kind of rely on the government having created like people, like the isolation of people, like people not having that support. And if we go out and that support and commit to support them, and that's by showing each other in whatever ways that we can, and we're seeing that happen more and more intentionally every single day, I feel like, because we're no longer seeing the state as like our route through it, like we get finally as like the attacker. And so I think, or like more like a deeper sort of like commitment to building that mutual aid network, as well as the resistance on the streets.
Okay, I think so. Kelsey, your camera seems to be closed. We could hear most of that. There was, unfortunately, you're cutting out a little bit, but I think we've got the main points about actually resisting, practically resistance on the streets, making the bill unworkable, and the mutual aid alliances as well being formed. And perhaps we can come back to see if there's anything you can expand on. But let's go to Josh on that question of what's the fight back basically.
And I don't have too much to add from that. I mean, one thing that Connor Woodman says, that the guy that I said who speaks about the kind of imperial boomerang effect, one thing that he says that I think is just really true is that the best way to undermine, undercover infiltrators and agent provocateurs is to build wide, big movements, to build mass movements. So there's something to be learned there about, like, if we remain kind of in small, self-selecting groups of activists, we leave ourselves quite susceptible. And actually, the bigger our movements are, the more we involve regular people in our movements, the more we kind of undermine that specific function of state repression. And I think that's something that a lot of groups are doing now. A lot of groups are thinking about how we organize and build mass movements, and that's one way that actually I think we're counteracting that form of repression. I think another thing is that in my book, there's a chunky section about digital security, and I think that's a reflection of like a wider culture that's been created in the movement, that's been inculcated over the years. Actually, it's really important we think about digital security, we learn about it, we go to great resources like Black Cross and Netpol and Big Brother Watch and all these different places, and understand the small things we can do to protect ourselves, to kind of erase our digital footprint, and to like work outside of the big corporations that, especially over the period of COVID, have really enhanced their ability to do surveillance through technology. And so I think that's something that we're all doing really well and getting better at. I think something we could get better at as a movement is learn from the repression of the past. And I think that book is a really good start, the one that was released a couple of years ago, edited by Aziz Chowdhury, that looks at different movements across time and invites people to reflect on some of the lessons we can learn from there. And I think the movement that's fighting back against Prevent, like Preventing Prevent and lots of other Prevent campaigns, are from what I can see, growing in strength. And there's a growing awareness around Prevent, and I think that's kind of only on the up. And again, I think it's really important that we all find a way we can support those movements. So yeah.
That's a really nice sort of slightly more sort of optimistic or hopeful note to kind of go into just a couple of questions, I think, from the audience we might just about have time for. We're unfortunately very short of time now. We've only got about 9 minutes or so left. But we've actually sort of somewhat covered some of the questions. But let's look at the first sort of two questions I think that have the most interest. I don't know if either of you can answer this. I personally can't. There's a question about how much from Adriana, how much can one get involved in protest while being a legal migrant student? And I think that means a student who's not a British national, who's here but has a student visa, I suppose, to be here. I think that's what that means. Do either of you have any thoughts on that? And I'll just say the second question too, that I'd like either one of you to answer if you can, which is the one we touched on before, which is, are liberal responses to social justice issues insufficient or in fact potentially damaging? And I'll leave it to either one of you to think, whether you want to try to address either, both. Shall we say, Kelsey, do you want to have can I turn to you first?
Yeah, I guess in terms of involvement, so I think also, like, we think about being involved in protests as having to be the one that's, making a speech, like face the camera right in the middle of all of it. And there's like so much that you can be involved in that doesn't like put your face out there and can be a bit more safe if you're worried about things like your migrant status and things like that when in getting involved in sort of in resistance. But there are lots and lots of groups that are made up of people who are experiencing those things, and yeah, like Josh said, it's these things of trying to do our best to improve our digital security and trying to do our best to look out for each other and just to really educate ourselves and each other on the risks. Like, when I think, like, yeah, not to give too much away, but like, I think people who organize protests and things, like, they check out the legal risks. They do like kind of try to inform people of their rights and these kinds of things in actions and stuff like that, in order to, so no one's really just going into it completely like, I have no idea what risks I'm taking. Part of what we want to do that's different from, say, how the state uses people in a disposable manner is for all of us to consensually be taking part in the ways that feel possible for us, Do
you have anything to add about the question of the liberal movements and whether these are merely insufficient or also damaging? I mean, if you don't, Kelsey, I'll go over to Josh, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, if you did have any thoughts.
I often think that they are damaging, I will say. I guess it depends on what response is, like, depends what we're calling liberalism, I suppose, but like liberalism in and of itself, and kind of lots of these, the responses that I'm thinking of are the kind of things that I listed before as kind of mainstream feminist responses that rely on building up of something like the criminal justice system, rely on more legislation, more state control, these kinds of things. I find them probably like gonna cause more damage, the things that we're gonna have to undo basically at a later date, that we probably shouldn't be campaigning for them now, and things that are gonna benefit some people at the detriment to others. You know, things like I often think about, like, we hold up Scandinavian countries as kind of like these amazing places to live with great quality of life and wonderful prison system and all these things, but we know that like those countries like rely heavily on the militarization of countries in the global south and benefit hugely from oppression in other places. And so I worry about kind of legislations that would create benefits for some people and not for others.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, Josh, could I get your thoughts on those questions as well?
Yeah, I mean, I really don't have much to add beyond what Kelsey said for the first person, except if you are thinking about, maybe you said this might sound was a bit funny, but if you are thinking about like going out into protest on the street, that you consider how you can like mitigate the chances of getting arrested, and just like try and avoid arrests basically, and stay ahead of the curve with the protest with that, and maybe even and importantly message the organisers of the protest if it isn't yourself, and kind of tell them about your situation. And normally protest organisers are quite on top of that and able to give good advice, and we've definitely had to do that before with protests. What was the question? Like are liberal responses insufficient or even damaging? Such a big question. I think Aaron Kanani, who's a really, really great writer and has written a lot about preventing counter-extremism and state repression and racism, he often describes this kind of this repressive infrastructure as like liberal democratic totalitarianism, and I think it's quite apt. I think, like, you know, oftentimes the kind of liberal voices of Great Britain are one side of the coin, and the other side of the coin are the illiberal voices of Great Britain. And actually both of them have this really profound belief in the virtue of the political economic system that we live under, and they will oftentimes meet the same ends. And so I think this question is maybe a bit more about it's about coalitions and political strategy. I think there are a lot of liberal institutions that are championing curtailing the excesses of these bills, and I personally think we'd be daft if we didn't work with them to try and do that, and we have multiple rails moving at the same time parallel to each other. And we understand, I think the important thing is us as a movement understanding the limits of our liberal friends. And obviously there are kind of like groups that, you know, purport to be liberal that actually are not our friends, that Kelsey have named, but there are groups that are, you know, kind of have a liberal bent to them, and we have to work with them. And I think also because we have temporal constraints to some of these things, especially when it comes to environmentalism, to a lot of things we have to think about political strategy in a kind of more pragmatic way, which doesn't mean that, you know, like for example with Kill the Bill, what we say is we want to kill the entirety of the bill, but that doesn't mean that we're like shitting on what other people are doing around the bill. So yeah, I think there's a final point to be made about, so I mean, something that I'm grappling with all the time, because strategy kind of should be testing the limits of what you think is right and wrong, and kind of around your politics, and to not be too dogmatic with your ideas. And I think like sometimes there's this thing in the West of like having these virtuous politics and like beating and using it as a stick to beat other places that don't have as clear-eyed radicalism as we have, you know. And in certain countries we might turn to them and be like, oh, they're, you know, we speak about the politics of certain countries. And I guess like it's really good for me to look at like decolonial struggles and kind of see how, you know, how some of these people we herald as like really like utopian figures were very pragmatic in how they did politics and drew up coalitions of people who were really shady, and sometimes it didn't pay off in the end. But I think we need to kind of imbibe that a bit sometimes. And I think, you know, Aimé Césaire spoke about this kind of like utopian pragmatism, like where can you marry this kind of like utopian idea with the pragmatism of the constraints of your political reality right now? And I think yes, they are insufficient and even damaging, but also, yes, we have to be strategic about how we work in and around these movements and organizations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, that's the thing, it raises sort of these broader questions of strategy, which you could probably have an evening talk just on that question. Unfortunately, we have basically run out of time, and I'm really, really sorry to a couple of people who've submitted questions that we're not going to get around to answering. I think it's just been such a kind of fascinating discussion, and we've touched on so many areas. It is very difficult, I think, to cover it all, or to feel that we've kind of turned over all the stones that we wanted to in the time that we've got. But I think, I hope people will take this as a kind of introduction, really, to start to think about activism and social movements in this way, and to try to start seeing the connections between things more and more. All that's left really to say is just to thank again our amazing speakers for their time, and to thank everybody for joining, and to say I really hope that you've all enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it enormously, and I hope that this might be the precursor to more events like this, where we can kind of further unpack some of the issues that we touched on this evening. So have a very good evening, everybody, and I'll just say goodbye. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
Guys.
Bye.
Bye.